Folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today, we are continuing on with our Unit 4 lectures on Transoceanic connections. And we are going to be looking at the diversity in the American colonies. So, what allowed for transatlantic exploration? What made it possible for Europeans to sail across the Atlantic Ocean? Today, we're learning about the diversity of American societies. We're going to start by specifically talking about Spanish America and Brazil. So, we are looking at topic 4.7. I know this is kind of out of order, but we are going to look at broader categories and the AP objectives, how they apply sort of to those broader categories. So your objective, regardless, is you will be able to explain how social categories, roles, and practices have been maintained or changed over time. So let's start talking about Spanish America. Well, obviously, we know already that the Columbian Exchange brought lots of change to the Americas. You have the obvious interchange of technology, the introduction of new people groups, so you have cultural clashes and miscommunication, different cultural norms. For example, when Europeans first arrived not very first, but when they were starting to make contact with North American tribes, the native peoples on the northeast coast thought the Europeans were just super gross, right? Because it was part of the cultural norms of the tribes on the East Coast to bathe frequently, to be clean shaven, to take a lot of pride in grooming. So you have these very neat and sort of fastidious self-presentation of the native peoples. And then these Europeans would arrive from England or France who would be super hairy, who maybe would bathe like once every 3 months, never brushed their teeth, never shaved, right? They smelled, they looked gross, they had lice. So this would be obviously a cultural clash. You also see clashes in religion, military clashes, and then, of course, the exchange of biological agents like smallpox, measles, typhus, as well as new crops and animals. So, if we are thinking about how this came to be, you have to trace colonization really back to the Reconquista. And really you have to trace it back to politics on the Iberian Peninsula. So let's actually go all the way back to the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate. When the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, they sought to eliminate the Umayyad clan from the face of the planet. It was very violent, and most Umayyads were killed, with the exception of sort of one branch of the family, who were able to flee from Damascus all the way to Cordoba, Spain, where they will establish the Al-Andalus Caliphate, and it's the start of many different Muslim caliphates, Muslim monarchies in what's modern-day Spain and Portugal. Now, in this context, these Muslim kingdoms were sometimes very tolerant of their Christian and Jewish neighbors, were sometimes very intolerant of their Jewish and Christian neighbors. It really just depended. If you remember, the Muslims tried to continue northward into Europe, but were defeated by Charlemagne and sort of were stymied at the Pyrenees Mountains. So you have this line, this dividing line with the rest of Christian Europe and Muslim Spain, and then North Africa. So over the centuries, you have ongoing conflict between the Christians living in the Iberian Peninsula and the Muslims. And over time, the Christians began eating away at the Muslim territory as the kingdoms weakened. Until eventually, in 1492, you have the completion of the Reconquista under Ferdinand and Isabella, and the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula is reclaimed for the Christians, for the Europeans. And so you have, from the get-go, this link between expansion and religion, this link between warfare and Catholicism. So, part of that, one of the results of that, and sort of an indirect result, will be the Spanish Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition is one extreme branch of the religious reunification of Spain that Isabella was trying to implement. Remember, Isabella is really the strength and the brains behind the couple. Ferdinand was mostly drunk. So, when they reconquer Granada, and originally Muslims and Jews are told you can stay there, and then they're told, well, you can only stay if you convert, and then those who did convert, the conversos, are viewed with suspicion, and so many Muslims and Jews are ordered to just leave the Iberian Peninsula. So they have this sort of Christian expansion mentality already in place when Columbus arrives in the Americas. So you have conquistadors starting to arrive in the Americas. You have the use of European guns, horses, and iron to offer advantages, especially in areas where there were already political chaos and population loss. The Spanish colonized the Americas first, starting in Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and then you have Francisco Pizarro with the Incas and Hernan Cortez with the Aztecs. So our early colonies are loose colonial administrations led by gold-hungry Europeans. And over time will become more formal administrations with agricultural settlements that will be established by bureaucrats who will arrive from Europe. So what is our model of colonization? First, you establish colonies. You declare the land part of the European mother country, right? I claim this land for Spain. You, of course, claim the most desirable land. The coastlines, the rivers, the lakes, the farmland, the mines. You try to recreate colonial societies on the institutions and the customs of your homeland. So in Spain's case, this is Catholic, patriarchal, same social hierarchy. We see that in Latin America, Native American elites would try to preserve their power by marrying into the Spanish elite. This is going to be pretty common and much more common in Latin America than we will see in North America. It's going to lead to the Caste system, and it will allow for native religion, language, and traditions to survive to some extent. Over time, you will need more labor, and so African slaves will be added to the cultural mix. Okay, so like I said, 4 steps of colonization. Step 1, establish colonies. Step 2, form encomiendas to organize labor and land. So land and labor supply will be rewarded to a conquistador. And Native Americans will be first used as laborers, but the unintended consequence was that native populations were decimated due to European disease, so you need more laborers. 1/5 of all treasure from the conquistadors went to the crown. Very few of our conquistadors are actually professional soldiers. They saw themselves as new nobility over indigenous people. So a lot of the conquistadors were actually sort of like the bastard sons of nobility. These were men who had a little bit of social power in Spain, but not much. They wouldn't be able to climb up the social hierarchy. They would be really limited in what they could do in their life. So they have sort of the attitude of a noble, but none of the wealth or power that goes along with it. So they would then go to the Americas and take their little bit of power, and all of a sudden it's now magnified. So they have a lot of power in the Americas in a way that they could never have in Spain. So step 1, establish colonies. Step 2, form encomiendas. I'll talk more about that later. Step 3, form cities. Our cities in Latin America will be based on the Roman design. Why the Roman design? Because the biggest cities in Spain were originally Roman cities and were built upon the same grid system that the Romans had used. So if you remember from last year in AP Human Geography, we talked about the Latin American city model, how at the center of the city would be a central plaza with your church, cathedral, and town halls, and then you would have a grid going out from that. Slowly, as your colonies get to be more formalized and urbanized, conquistadors will be removed from positions of government power and replaced with professional bureaucrats, so professional government workers. Okay. So, step 1, establish colonies. Step 2, form encomiendas. Step 3, form cities. And step 4, replace the conquistadors. Where does the Catholic Church fit into all this? Well, it's important to remember the Catholic Church is not a monolith, right? During this time, you have the Protestant Reformation rocking the church in Europe. You also have the Counter-Reformation reforming the Catholic Church from within. And so just remember, always add a little asterisk when we make overarching statements. But in general, the Catholic Church justified conquest with evangelism, right? Yes, it's not good to conquer and murder. On the other hand, it is good to tell them about Jesus. So as long as you're doing that, we can kind of overlook the conquering and the murdering. The Catholic Church did not just communicate a message of Christianity to the native peoples, but they were also communicating a message of European culture, language, and technology. So a Catholic priest you should know for the Americas is going to be Bartolomé de las Casas. He is often going to be cited for a primary source for this time period because he's going to write a lot about the plight of the Native Americans, right? So he's the first bishop of Chiapas. He will really devote his life to protecting Amerindians from exploitation. So he arrives in 1502 as a settler, looks at the horrific treatment of the native peoples, raping, pillaging, cutting off a hand because they didn't bring you enough gold. He is just horrified and disgusted and decides to devote his life to Christianity. So he becomes a monk. Then he returns to the Americas to serve and protect and write an account of the atrocities being committed by the Spanish. And he sends them back to Europe where they're published. So it is part of his influence that will lead to laws being passed in 1542 that will limit the ability of Spanish settlers to compel Native Americans to labor for them. Of course, by that point, you already have massive devastation, and so it's a little bit too little too late. But it's important to note that not all Europeans were just in favor of violent oppression. So do watch this. This is going to be an excerpt from Bartolomé de las Casas. It's being read aloud. And so it's a primary source, but it gives you a sense of some of the treatment of the Native Americans by the Europeans and exposes you to the treatment by the Europeans. All right, let's talk about the colonial economies. So the economic structure of the Spanish colonies in particular. Colonies will be taxed heavily to benefit the colonizers. You have to understand that the whole point of colonies is to benefit the mother country, not anyone living in the colonies. This will become a point of contention over time. But at the beginning here, everyone's in agreement. Yeah, this is all for the good of Spain because you don't have a separate colonial identity yet. So Spain will use what is known as the encomienda system. It allows for authority over native populations in the Spanish colonies. So essentially, as part of the encomienda system, Spain says you have this amount of land and you have control over all the native peoples who live there. So it gives the Spanish a supply of cheap labor and the periodic payment of goods, right? They're kind of trying to recreate the feudal system in the Americas with the native peoples being more like slaves and serfs. Hypothetically, Europeans were expected to be responsible to the natives, were supposed to evangelize to them, teach them about Christianity. They were supposed to protect them and feed them and care for them. And yes, you could use them for labor, but you weren't supposed to abuse them. The reality is, natives were abused. They were not paid like they were supposed to be. They died in huge numbers. And the encomenderos gained huge amounts of natives and tracts of lands. We see that in an effort to protect the native peoples, you still have bigotry in place. So, for example, Bartolomé de las Casas says like, hey, we need to stop abusing the native peoples like this. Instead, we should use African slaves. So the encomienda system is not sustainable. It turns into, the repartimiento system. And one of the reasons why you have this shift is because of complaints about how natives were being treated. It also has to do with the crown being frustrated with these new encomenderos. So instead, with this new system, you grant a small salary to Indian workers, but it still created slave-like conditions, especially in the silver mines. So we see the encomienda system especially being used for agriculture. For mining, we still see the use of the mita system, right? This old Incan system. It's going to be really particular to Peru in particular. And the Spanish version is going to be less equitable than the Incan version, right? So it's mandatory labor with small salaries, usually in silver mines. And it required an adult male Amerindian to work 2 to 4 months out of the year for Spain. So agriculture and mining were the basis of the Spanish colonial economy. 80% of the indigenous population lived and worked on the land. So if we're talking about agriculture, you have the establishment of haciendas, these rural estates, which will become the basis of wealth and power. And these haciendas are very self-sufficient for basic goods. They are really just taking care of themselves. One of the main crops that these haciendas will start to produce is going to be sugar, especially for Brazil. So haciendas will be powered by the encomienda and mita systems. However, the big moneymaker for Spain is not going to be agriculture at first. It is going to be mining. So gold will be found in Brazil, the Caribbean, Colombia, Chile. Silver mines will be discovered in Peru and Mexico. So you make bouillon, you melt down the silver and the gold into solid bars, and you ship it back. You should know about the Potosi mine in Bolivia. It's a great example. It's a huge source of silver for Spain. 80% of the silver that Spain is bringing across the Atlantic is coming from the Potosi mine. And they used forced native labor. So Spanish galleons, Spanish ships, would carry silver bullion to Spain. This will cause massive inflation in the Spanish economy and lead to an increase in piracy in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. The fact of the matter is less than 1/2 of the silver mined will actually stay in Spain. Most of the silver will be kept in the New World, and what's left will go to Spain to finance wars, pay off debt, and spent on luxury goods. So we see sort of a lack of manufacturing in colonial Latin America. Latin America will export sugar and silver and import manufactured goods. So, what's the encomienda system? How was it changed? Why? And where is the silver coming from? Okay, let's talk a little bit about Brazil. So, let's do a little bit of timeline here. In 1500, Pedro Cabral will find Brazil on his way to India. He misses India. By 1532, Portugal officially settles Brazil. They will establish sugar plantations using Indian labor on the Brazilian coast. And sugar plantations require tremendous amounts of labor. So they start to bring over slaves to support plantations. Because if you remember, Portugal already had trade agreements with kingdoms on the West African coast. And so it was an easy connection there for the economic system they already had established. So by 1700, Brazil will have over 150,000 slaves. This will be half of Brazil's total population. 7,000 slaves will be imported every year. By 1549, Jesuit missionaries have arrived, and by 1695, they find gold. So, as the rest of Europe starts to get involved with colonization, we see the Dutch, the French, and the English colonies beginning to produce produce sugar as well. This is a threat to the Brazilian monopoly on sugar. Luckily, gold is found. This gold rush will begin to stimulate the economy and really begin to open up the interior of Brazil for settlement, right? A lot of Brazil is jungle, and so it's not easily settled. It also increases the need for slaves. In the 18th century, Brazil is the greatest source for gold in the West, and Rio de Janeiro will emerge as an important port city because it was the closest to the gold mines. It will also be the place where African slaves will be received for the mines. And in 1763, it will become the capital of the Brazilian colony. Okay. Now let's talk about society in general for Latin America. These are things that can be applied to both Spain and Portugal and their colonies, Spanish and Portuguese colonies. These things cannot be applied to the British colonies in North America. So the society in Latin America is going to be very multiracial. You have new people groups emerging in these colonized lands. The fact of the matter is very few women travel to the New World. They are not interested in leaving their communities. The Iberian Peninsula is very patriarchal. So it's not like women could go to the Americas and start working. No, you'd sit around at home surrounded by strangers while your husband went off and did stuff, right? It's very isolating, not appealing at all. So what do European men in the colonies do? Well, it's not like they all become priests and suddenly become celibate. They meet and mingle with elite native women. They marry these women. They have sex with other women. Like, there's mixing. So, mixed marriages and sexual exploitation were very common. Europeans are going to be there as conquerors and migrants. You also have the Indians, our indigenous populations there, and then you have the African slaves. So over time, the Spanish crown will grow concerned about the inadvertent creation of a new social elite due to the system's land distribution and are sort of not sure what to do with these sort of new social classes. This is a really interesting painting because it depicts a married couple that's biracial, right? European dude, native woman, mixed race children. And it's not critical of that, right? It's depicting a loving family, a wealthy family. So you should know this hierarchy. This is called, it's essentially a caste system. It's known as the Castas system, Sociedad de Castas. It's this social hierarchy emerging based off racial origins. So at the very top of our social hierarchy, you have the Peninsulares. These are people born in Europe. Europeans living in the Americas who were born in Europe. Peninsulares. Then you have the Creoles. Creoles are white people born in the Americas, right? So Peninsulares are Europeans who had been born in Europe and then migrated. Creoles would often be their children, right? Or grandchildren. Creoles would be of European descent, but they will have been born and raised in the colonies. Mestizos are a mix of European and indigenous peoples, right? So if you are a mix of native and European, you're a mestizo. The next level down would be mulattoes, which would be a mix of European and African descent, usually the result of the sexual exploitation of African slave women. Then you would have native peoples. Then Zambos, who are mixed indigenous and African. Then free Africans, and then finally African slaves. Right? So here's the main thing to remember. Born in Europe, you're at the top. White people born in the Americas are next. Then mixed, then Native Americans, and at the bottom of the hierarchy are our slaves. Okay, so how did the state and the church operate in the New World? Well, Spain organized the territory into viceroyalties. So all of Latin America under Spanish control was part of New Spain. And then you'd have viceroyalties, like the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, the viceroyalty of New Spain, aka Mexico, the viceroyalty with a capital city in Lima. So the viceroy has the authority in the colony on behalf of the king, kind of like a governor. These viceroyalties, the leadership here will create laws, enforce the laws, collect taxes, and assign work to the Native Americans. You would see that these viceroyalties have their own judicial systems in place. You will also have the establishment of the Council of Indies, which is part of your bureaucracy, your government system, which will issue laws, advise the king on the New World, and generally oversee the colonies. Simultaneously, separate from the political control of the colonies, You have the missionary work of the Catholic Church, especially the Jesuits. Remember the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, will emerge out of the Counter-Reformation, who take their faith very seriously in education and evangelism very seriously. So the Jesuits will arrive along with the Franciscans and the Dominicans. They will establish churches and missions to spread the Catholic faith. You can see the whole mission system here in the American West, especially. You can go up the coast of California and just go from Spanish mission to Spanish mission. We have one of these Spanish missions here in town with the San Javier mission. The goal here is to spread Catholic faith, and these missionaries will have a profound influence on the cultural and intellectual life of the colonies. So if you are taking AP art history, one of the things you will look at is the art that is created in the Spanish colonies or as a result of the Spanish influence in the New World. This is also something you could look at when you are picking a piece of art for your art history extra credit. Okay, let's do a few practice questions to finish up. Pause, read the source, and then answer the questions. All of the following pieces of evidence in the passage directly support the author's claim that the pestilence was terrible, except which of the following pieces of evidence does the author use to support his claim that the arrival of the Spanish destroyed our people? Which of the following pieces of evidence does the author use to support his implicit argument that Maya society underwent a dramatic cultural change in the 16th century? So for your summary, I want you to explain how social categories, roles, and practices have been maintained or changed over time, specifically in the Latin American colonies. Remember, your summaries should be at the very least 5 sentences. You are looking to ace your summary, answer the prompt, cite evidence, explain your evidence. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.